À-bas-le-ciel.
That's the parliament for the province. The parliament did not employ a single translator for any native language, for Cree or Ojibwe or Dene or any of the others. And so whenever someone stood up and spoke in a native language in parliament, it was not recorded, it was not transcribed, it was neither recorded for history nor influenced politics. So that's the kind of very real erasure that's going on in a country where now, when I put my card into an ATM, into a bank machine, my choices are, do you want English, French, or Chinese? I don't have a choice for Cree or Ojibwe or Mohawk. So that's the question facing Canada. From my perspective as a white person, the question is, are we going to sign off on the slow motion genocide, on suffocating the last life out of these languages? Are we going to be the last generation that has even any memory of what our grandparents and great-grandparents could speak of this heritage disappearing forever? Or are we going to take a stand and try to turn the situation around? But if you put it this way, in Canada, if we close down every single department of Chinese literature, it would not make a goddamn bit of difference. It's not like people in China would be saying, oh no, what is the future of Chinese literature going to be now that they've shut down the great department that studies Chinese literature in Vancouver and Toronto? But guess what? This whole world of Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk, it's hanging by a thread. And if we don't take responsibility for it and step up in Canada, nobody else is going to do it.
À-bas-le-ciel.
This is Jay Costley, so lately the host of Cruelty-Free Cosplay. Is that the channel? Did I get it wrong?
That is the channel's name.
Okay.
It's not actually a name, it's a thing, it's an ideal, but it is what the channel's called.
Right. So you could, you could, rebrand to Vegan Zookeeper Club, Vegan Fox Hunting Society. People who've been watching my channel for 4 years will remember that Jay came on and we talked a lot about the ethics of what I call wildlife management paradigm. So animals in the wild, animals in zoos, the role of research, the different conflicting factors and how zoos operate. And I basically grew up in the museum field. And museums, like zoos, are this really weird mix of for-profit tendencies. Just like in some ways, museums are the same as Disneyland. They're just trying to make the most money possible out of a crummy attraction. In some ways, they're educational. In some ways, they're trying to be research-based or academic. And likewise, we talked about zoos, both from this vegan perspective and just institutional and political perspective. So if you guys think you recognize him, that's where you know him from. But he's also always been a cosplay enthusiast, and now his channel about cosplay, and very often the overlap between cosplay and vegan concerns. So look, this is an extraordinary day because you actually wrote down some things you want to talk to me about, some questions. Let's start with number one on the list, yeah?
I actually wanted to ask you a question about something that you had said in one of your videos specifically about the Cree. I think it was about the Cree anyway.
Sure.
But I remember one video you had said that you had the experience because you studied those languages and you had the experience of talking to people within those tribes who had not become so strong with the language and how they had expressed the desire that they basically had wished that they had more of that training, that they were more intact with that part of who they were in a sense. And I don't remember. I just remember you had kind of that one little note. I didn't know if is there any particular aspect of the language or just everything in general. They wish they were more intimate with it.
Well, that's basically the tragedy of the whole current generation. For the Cree, the Ojibwe, and I'd say most of the large ethnic groups of Native Canadians. Now, there are exceptions, so I'll just say, so what you've just said, this is a huge sort of tragedy or struggle for this generation, for the Cree, the Ojibwe, not particularly for the Inuit. The Inuit are up in the Arctic, they have a different situation, not for a couple of the groups on the far east coast. So there are some exceptions, but the bulk of Canada, that's the tragedy, and the tragedy runs as follows. They had about 3 generations that were put into these violent and demeaning forced assimilation schools where they were beaten if they spoke their own language, and then forced to speak either English or French. By the way, that's another problem a lot of them struggle with is actually English versus French within Canada. You get First Nations people who are isolated even further because they can only communicate in French. But because they were given French Catholic schoolmasters, because the Catholic the Catholic Church wanted those souls, let me tell you, they were motivated. They just wanted it more. The Catholics were out there, with their well-organized nuns and priests, and there were a lot of rapes and a lot of mysterious pregnancies and a lot of mysterious abortions and a lot of mysterious anal sex, all the things that come with the Catholic Church having unlimited power over poor and helpless people in those kinds of circumstances. And yes, that's all documented, and it's all been through the courts in Canada now, so believe me, it's not my imagination running wild. Anyone can Google this and find a huge stack of legally vetted documents. So this isn't peer review. These have been through the court system. They've been fact-checked in a court of law, and settlements have been paid for them. So it's not just my opinion. But the first generation to go through that trauma, they generally actually did continue speaking their own language amongst themselves, but they did not pass on the language to the next generation. And then the next generation will grow up monolingual, either only in English or only in French, but again, speaking those languages poorly. So there is, everywhere you go in Canada, there's a distinctive First Nations accent. And it's very hard for them to get a job. I mean, there's already racism against them. But it is true, if you have a stereotypical First Nations accent in most of Canada, that's regarded as a huge liability. I think much more than having a Chinese accent or many other, or an Italian accent, let's say. An Italian accent or a British accent is no barrier at all in Canada. But the First Nations accent, this is definitely part and parcel of this kind of racism and this legacy. And now we're into a third generation that in many ways wants to recapture the culture and language and heritage that was lost. Maybe their grandparents or their great-grandparents, maybe there's some memory of the family of what the language was, the language and the mythology and the history. Because at the end of the day, being Cree, being Ojibwe, being Mohawk, it has to mean more than the color of your skin. It has to mean more than your family tree. And all the ways for it to be more meaningful really are connected to the language. To give an example, this is a very real example. I'm not being snide. I went to a political protest where it was all Cree people. There could have been a few Dene. They were all First Nations people, but the vast majority were Cree. And they played the drums and they chanted. But I was studying Cree as a language at that time, and I was there with my wife, who's now my ex-wife, and I just pointed out to her, they're chanting. But they're chanting nonsense words. They know what this song is supposed to sound like, but none of them can actually speak the language enough, at this protest, to sing in the Cree language. So, you can imagine that for any other language. You can kind of make noises that resemble what singing Cree would like. But I said to her, look, I've read about this in real peer-reviewed articles, real anthropological and historical research. This kind of song used to have lyrics. These songs were all about something, and we do have a very small number of them were translated and recorded for history that way. Anthropologists or other researchers actually wrote down the words, but we now have a generation of Native Americans, Cree, Ojibwe, etc., where the drum is still powerful, the sound of the music is still powerful. In that context, they were doing it as an active political protest. But it's hollow. It's hollow in a very real sense because the words have lost their meaning. On the flip side of that, I shocked Ask Yourself, this guy Isaac, Ask Yourself, by pointing out that when I was in Saskatchewan, the parliament there, so that's the parliament for the province, the parliament did not employ a single translator for any native language, for Cree or Ojibwe or Dene or any of the others. And so whenever someone stood up and spoke in a native language in Parliament, it was not recorded, it was not transcribed, it was neither recorded for history nor influenced politics. So the words that were being spoken in Parliament, everything being said in English was being recorded, everything being said in French was being recorded. But whenever native people stood up and spoke in Cree, it was being deleted from history because the government couldn't employ 2 people, 5 people, to record that for history. You don't even have to translate it. You just have to have someone who knows the language well enough to listen to a recording and then type out the words, right? That's transcription, not translation. They didn't even have that. So that's the kind of very real erasure that's going on in a country where now, when I put my card into an ATM, into a bank machine, my choices are, do you want English, French, or Chinese? I don't have a choice for Cree or Ojibwe or Mohawk. So that's the question facing Canada. From my perspective as a white person, the question is, are we going to sign off on the slow motion genocide, on suffocating the last life out of these languages? Are we going to be the last generation that has even any memory of what our grandparents and great-grandparents could speak of this heritage disappearing forever? Or are we going to take a stand and try to turn the situation around? And for Native people, as I say, it's very different. The Cree people I knew, a lot of them were very emotionally, to be blunt, they were very emotionally fucked up about the loss of language and their desire to reclaim and recapture the language. And yeah, from coast to coast in Canada, you see different attempts, some successful and many failures at language revival.
Is there one of those languages, I think you said Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk, that's more intact or less intact?
Sure. For you, if you wanted one to dabble in, it would definitely be Ojibwe. Ojibwe is also known as Anishinaabemowin, but Ojibwe, I'm going to refer to it as Ojibwe in this conversation. But Ojibwe, one of the advantages is that it exists both in the United States and Canada. It exists on both sides of the border, whereas Cree is entirely in Canada. So it's more of an option for you. And so Ojibwe has some institutional support from the University of Minnesota, UMN, University of Minnesota. And they do have at least one course, a Pimsleur-type course, audio CD course to help you learn the language. So Ojibwe has a shot in America and in Canada. And so for someone like you, that would be an option. And, within Canada, Cree has the best chance. The problem is Cree is spread out over a huge area. And, I mean, Cree is absolutely, it's within one generation of extinction. I mean, it's now or never for Cree. But sure, it's in the best shape of any of those languages. And again, so the exception is, normally when I'm talking about First Nations, I'm talking about south of the Arctic First Nations. It is indeed a totally different situation for the Inuit and other groups that are entirely, on the ice. People who live that far north where there are no trees. People who eat seal meat. We had a musician who won an award in downtown Toronto who was Inuit. And when she accepted the award, it's like a situation like an Oscar award ceremony. She stood up at the podium. She stood there and she said, "White people should wear more seal fur and eat more seal meat because, my cousins want to make more money out of hunting seals and whales. And white people don't buy this stuff anymore. It's become unfashionable, wearing fur." That was her acceptance speech. She won, she won for some album she recorded. Said, that's a moving message, Maybe I should start wearing more sealskin and polar bear fur. A polar bear cape would look great on me. So yeah, I just mentioned this is not some kind of stereotype, but yeah, their situation is much different. So with that exception, I mean, if you were interested in going north of the Arctic Circle, really the far north, then basically, yeah, Cree and Ojibwe, and they are very, very similar languages, Cree and Ojibwe. So each of them has a shot. Within Canada, we have a hybrid language which is called Oji Cree, OJI-CREE, and that's even closer. So to give an example, if you chose to work on Oji Cree, you could very easily cope with both Ojibwe and Cree. So again, that's an appealing option for someone like me. Say, okay, maybe I can get the best of both worlds and this kind of thing. But if you put it this way, in Canada, if we close down every single department of Chinese literature, it would not make a goddamn bit of difference. It's not like people in China would be saying, oh no, what is the future of Chinese literature going to be now that they've shut down the great department that studies Chinese literature in Vancouver and Toronto? Nobody gives a fuck. Canada's second-rate imitation of Chinese literary studies is never going to matter. And the same would be true of German literature. And if you want to talk about Buddhism, it's just not the case that people in Thailand are going to be worried about the future of Buddhism if Canada were to shut down every single academic department studying Buddhist philosophy. It's going to have zero impact on Thailand or Sri Lanka. They don't give a fuck. And objectively, from a global perspective, we can say it doesn't matter. But guess what? This whole world of Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk, it's hanging by a thread. And if we don't take responsibility for it and step up in Canada, nobody else is going to do it. It's just not the case that the great universities in Berlin and Paris are going to, step up here. We in Canada put all of our money, both in terms of education and high culture policy. So, something like, museums and the opera and the ballet. In Canada, the government pours money into all that crap so that we can have a second-rate imitation of European culture. So we can have the Toronto Ballet and the Vancouver Ballet and the Montreal Orchestra and, whatever, the à-bas-le-ciel, music festival and this kind of stuff. It's all about imitating European culture. But the one thing that we're always going to be first-rate at is actually our own indigenous culture, Even if we're terrible, even if we do a terrible job. We've been doing a terrible job, we've been driving this culture to extinction. Nobody else in the world makes, Inuit statues. We have this unique tradition of statuary made primarily out of the tusks of, walruses and whale bone and this kind of material. Completely unique art form, okay? We're not imitating anybody. We're the best at that. We're the best. We're always going to be the best. Anything that's really uniquely rooted in or growing out of, even if it's modern, because by the way, I'm not a traditionalist. I'm all for, First Nations culture taking on bold new directions. But whatever those new directions are, if they're really uniquely Canadian, that's what we need to have academically and politically, and culturally the support for. That's all we can ever be excellent at. And if we fuck this up, it's over. It's genocide. It's the end game to cultural genocide. It's not like Cree literature is going to continue in Berlin or Beijing or anywhere else. It's here or it's nowhere. And I'm sure I could say the same thing with only minor modifications if we were talking about native tribes south of the border in the United States. But as you know, that's not my area. I just worked on First Nations in Canada. So, yeah.
Is that true? How do I want to say this? Like you talked about, Canada's being particularly noteworthy for some of the architecture and artwork from First Nations people, and just the things to see is what was left behind and things like that. Is that something also that you find that the current generations are disconnected from? Whether it's things or the history of those things.
I keep it 100% real. I'm not going to bullshit you. So our native people never built the pyramids. They never built a great monument like this, like the pyramids of ancient Egypt. I'm not someone who wants to exaggerate the glory of their architecture. Let's just stick with that example. But architecture being used here as a shorthand for other forms of material culture. I'm not someone who wants to lie to you that way. Interestingly, when my father was much younger, probably when my father was my age, he did. I remember I read one of his old books, one of his books he wrote when he was relatively young, and it was full of this really insincere exaggeration of the greatness of the accomplishments of Native Canadian art, basically. But my point is, what is Canadian architecture historically? If it's just an imitation of European architecture, it's nothing. Then there is no Canadian architecture. And for the most part, that's true. When you're talking about white people in Canada imitating European architecture, there is no Canadian architecture. If you even have a hybrid culture, if you have a culture where it's European technology but working with native culture and native culture appropriating European building methods, you could have a distinctive Canadian architecture growing out of that. And that's basically what you had in Mexico. And that's actually the national pride of Mexico, is their mixed culture, is their culture that is neither indigenous nor European, but is a hybrid, taking advantage of elements from both sides of the ocean. Now, there's also mythology about that. The Mexicans want to make it seem like everyone was equal. And of course, the reality of colonialism and genocide and the Catholic Church is a lot more brutal than that. However, you can't take it away. It is genuinely true. There is Mexican art. And it's not Spanish art. There is Mexican cuisine. There's Mexican food. And it's not Spanish cuisine. And there is Mexican architecture. And absolutely none of those things is true of Canada, because the British Empire in Canada was not based on a hybrid culture or a cooperative culture or finding any of those things. The culture in Canada was based on absolute genocide. I just mentioned as one example of that, there were historically a few newspapers printed in Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk, in these native languages. They normally didn't last very long. And our national archives, destroyed them, didn't even keep them. Our government didn't keep a copy, and they've disappeared from history. Now, I did not look into every single example, but I think I looked into every example for both Cree and Ojibwe at least. I went to the archives, looking into this. Of course, you can do it partially over the internet, but I also did visit archives in person and talk to professors. Said, is there any trace of the newspapers that were published in these languages? No, there's not. Why? Because the white people who controlled those institutions saw their role as the extinction, the progressive extinguishment of those cultures and languages. So it's not an accident. Those books were actually burned or thrown in the garbage and so on. Those newspapers were destroyed. They were not kept for history because they thought the future of Canada was a whites-only future. And again, Mexico, as bad as it was, Mexico also had slavery and genocide and terrible things. But there, at least, there was a vision of a mixing, of an inclusive and hybridizing cultural tendency. And again, another disaster is Brazil. But in Brazil also, they basically assumed that people were gonna intermarry. So anyway, there were alternatives to this outright genocidal approach.
The reason why I asked that question specifically is because, and literally in the middle of this conversation, I remember two brief conversations that were buried in the archives of Matt Colombo's failed zookeeper history. But
right.
But there's this one conversation that I'd never thought about before, but now I reflect on a completely different way. And it was literally a fragment of a 5-minute conversation. But we were basically discussing, we had basically rescued 5 new wolves from this place that got closed down. It was a big operation where they seized hundreds of animals, but they had 5 gray wolves somehow. And basically what the organization wanted to do is what they were thinking about doing was they were exploring the idea of, because they had done this before, but allowing the tribe to name the wolves as kind of gesture of respect. And I remember the conversation we were having was basically how the manager didn't think that was a good idea, because he felt literally if we asked them to vote, this is his exact quote, they'll want to name all the wolves Chief Joseph, who was some leader, historical figure for that tribe. He was like, what we should do is we should just pick the Native American names ourselves and offer it up to them and let them pick one of the 5 for each wolf. And just reflecting on that, how not only did we expect them to be true to some grandiose idea of what their we believed their culture was, but also that they would pick the ones that we wanted.
Right. We'll decide what native culture is, and then in their interests, right? Yeah. No, in some ways that's definitely the tragedy of maybe the 1980s attitude in a nutshell. Yeah. We had a situation that my wife started researching, and then she never got that far in the research. But a bizarre situation on one reservation where the Indian agent, that was the term used in Canadian government, so the man who was basically the dictator, he had total power over the given plot of land and all the natives living on it. The Indian agent decided to take a tribe and perform a eugenic experiment where he separated the members of the tribe whom he considered genetically superior and had them interbreed and gave them better education and did intelligence tests and this kind of thing. And as you can imagine, his idea of genetic superiority boiled down to how much they resembled white people as opposed to resembling native people. And still to this day, that tribe is divided by that experiment. The people who were genetically superior are on one plot of land, and the people who were genetically inferior are on another, next to each other. And they still have a legal dispute over who owns what farmland. Some of the losers in that eugenic experiment want more of the land back that was taken away from them because the best land was given to those people. So, I mean, these are the games that white people played. We have this kind of stupid saying in English, you know, power corrupts, and, you know, sort of infinite power, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Human reality is a lot more complicated than that. I think the greatest tragedy is that guy, he probably really sincerely believed he was helping those people while he did it. And, you know, it's not that well known, but if you Google it, you'll find evidence to confirm this. The famous left-wing economist, John Maynard Keynes, he wasn't that left-wing, but he's claimed, the left-wing claim him as left-wing now. But anyway, he was certainly left of center, John Maynard Keynes, famous economist. He went to his grave preaching eugenics. He felt the science of eugenics was going to be the salvation of mankind. So, yeah, obviously he wasn't Adolf Hitler, I mean, you know, but it's amazing that very often those people, it's not that absolute power has corrupted them absolutely. It's that they're sincere believers in ideals that are, in a word, evil.
À-bas-le-ciel.
I worked at the first captive management place I worked at was in Winchester, Idaho, which is on Nez Percé. I think it's Nez Percé. I don't remember. I think there was a more accurate French pronunciation out there, but their facility was actually on their land. And you know, I think growing up, you know, especially reading books and watching movies, you get this idea that Native Americans are specifically interested in conservation efforts regarding like native animals and things like that.
Right.
You know, specifically highlighting things like, you know, a background, a tradition that like incorporates them in a big way. I can especially think of one movie that was directly tied to this captive management place that I had, where a big part of the movie was talking about, you know, working with this one tribe, you know, to come up with, you know, they were supposedly integrally in part of like the actual program that they were running there, making decisions about the pack and things like that, and some of the ceremonies and things like that they held surrounding bringing those wolves onto the land. But that was kind of like what I was coming in there with, and the experience that I actually had with them, from the perspective of a 21-year-old biology student who cared deeply about conservation and had honestly never seriously met a Native American person in his entire life, was completely negative. I mean, we had, you know, all the people I think who caused problems there were First Nations people of that tribe, who we had rules like they were basically allowed to kind of sort of do whatever they wanted on the land because it was their land. But we did have people who would, you know, they would completely go off the paths and completely go into places where they would actually scare the wolves and things like that, that we had to deal with, and there was some like pushback with management and us, the people on the ground, as far as what to do about that and things like that. The one thing I remember though was like it was my first time experiencing like someone with a name like Bob White Eagle. Like, right. I remember that name specifically. That was absolutely fascinating to me. Some of the names, like, but yeah, just like I remember stories from other people about a particular Nez Percé person bringing his grandchildren on the site and basically walking through the entire visitor center and basically just talking like a number of times, mentioning, "Oh, I hope they made the white men pay a lot for this," and things like that. I remember one experience particularly where we had a green outhouse basically on site, and one of the things that I don't remember why we did it, but we basically dumped it out on the land like at some point, and I remember specifically the manager said, if any Nez Percé people come here, don't tell them that we did that, because they literally say we don't want white man shit on our land. So I had this, and you know, basically from my perspective, like a lot of the stories from what I talked with the management weren't actually true about them being involved and stuff, and from, you know, just the wolf facility in of itself, they weren't really respectful from that. So that was really interesting to me to see that kind of contrast, what I you know, had read about and seen movies about.
Well, I think that it kind of explains, you kind of had your mind a bit blown the first time we talked about this, because I remember like it wasn't like we had a hostile conversation, but I was really saying to you, look, you know, like First Nations people, Native American people, they're fundamentally people. Like, you know, they're not elves, They're not, they're not guardian spirits of the forest. They're, and I remember, so for you at that time, you were kind of putting together, reflecting on this experience in your past, and my very kind of political realist view of saying, look, for a lot of them, the land they've been given finally, normally after a legal battle with the federal government, the land they now own, that's the only way they have to make money, and they're looking at all the ways to try to earn a living out of that land, whether it's forestry or other, economically and ecologically exploitative practices for the most part, they're normally not looking at running the land as a non-profit national park, and if they were, it would be a national park. It wouldn't be their land. So yeah, those are tensions I was really familiar with from Canada. I remember the first time you and I talked about that, you were a little taken aback. Just saying it's a different perspective to think about. I remember you saying, yeah, now that I think about it, but yeah, it's a very strange kind of moral presupposition that white people demand that First Nations have. A code of ethics that white people themselves have never had. And they say, okay, this is your land. This is how you're supposed to earn a living. Now, don't earn a living. Instead, be self-sacrificing and live in poverty for the sake of habitat conservation. And that's not what that land is for. We have that problem even with endangered. Well, I guess endangered is the word, but endangered sea creatures on the west coast of Canada was a real question. Well, why don't First Nations people have the right to eat abalone? So, abalone is this kind of giant clam-like creature at the bottom of the ocean. It's like, well, the government decided that it's better for the government if Native people's land is a reserve for abalone. But if it's actually their land, why don't they have the right to eat their own abalone the same way, white people have been taking away all the abalone all this time and hunting them to the edge of extinction? So these are the contradictions inherent in the situation. But sure, if it's their land, if they own it, then it's not a national park. And if it's a national park, then it's not their land. They don't own it. So they're mutually exclusive categories. Yeah, anyway, so where do you want to go? Yeah.
Well, the first thing that I thought about, I remember the first thing I thought about after you, that was kind of your reflection.
Yeah. Because
you're right. I hadn't expected that on a big level. But I remember the manager who worked there, one of his big hero stories was basically coming back at night and finding a First Nations person of that tribe on the land, basically cutting down trees on our site. Because logging's a big thing down in Idaho. Right. And I remember he had this whole story about being at gunpoint and stuff like that, and talking the guy down, and it was this completely negative hero versus villain situation that that right. Reflection completely put another spin on.
Right. Who owns the tree anyway? Right. Yeah. I remember my wife and I, now my ex-wife, I'm divorced. My ex-wife and I, we bumped into this guy in Taiwan who had a PhD. I think it was a PhD in anthropology. And he was still a true believer in this idea that somehow Native people are not real people. He really regarded them as elves or spirits of the forest. And, when we were talking about deforestation, I really blew his mind. We were talking about it both in Latin America and in Southeast Asia. And I said, look, the deforestation you're talking about, when Native people aren't driven off their land, when they're not driven off the land genocidally or what have you, then they are the source of the deforestation. They're the ones cutting down the trees and making money out of it. And I said, what part of this don't you understand? He really did have a view. I mean, it sounds ridiculous when you explain it so clearly, but he was a white man from an American university with a PhD. He really did seem to think that cutting down trees and making money out of it is somehow something that only white-skinned people do, and not brown-skinned people in Asia, and not brown-skinned people in South America. And again, it's just not true. Now, conversely, I've also had some really surreal conversations with Native people, with First Nation people, where I've had to say to them, you're not the only people who use bows and arrows. Like in the history of England, using bows and arrows is a huge part of our history too, where I had to say, look, I know you think about this as if our culture is so different from yours, but, really, I'm not joking. That's quite a tense conversation, because I remember particularly one woman who was at my university. She seemed to regard the bow and arrow as if it was a unique symbol only of Native Americans. I was like, no. The whole history of Europe and most of Asia, of East Asia, was a major part of warfare right up until we had gunpowder. So anyway, yeah, some of these things we have in common: making money out of deforestation, killing our fellow man with bows and arrows.
À-bas-le-ciel.